Yeah, no, I've been around for a long time. So, yeah, kind of awkward because I'm so not familiar with the discipline. But I was very encouraged by the conversation that started to surface, because I think I'm going to pick up on some of the points that were raised there. So there's tremendous diversity and unevenness in the various knowledges that are defined as African feminist. Some focus on colonial legacies and nationalist struggles. In ways that actually play down critical attention to gendered power. And I'm thinking here of the emphasis on colonized men's emasculation and the calls to address this, which is associated with sort of womanist type thinking. Some versions fixate on pre-colonial pasts in ways that implicitly or explicitly define colonialism as the source of all gendered, classed, and racialized injustices. And there's a tendency towards this within the work of Ife Amadume and Oyerumi. Apart from these sorts of differences, defining African feminist knowledge in terms of subject matter or the perspectives or geographical location of knowledge makers is also tricky. Is feminist knowledge African if the subject matter is African, if the writer self-defines as African, if the writer is located in Africa? So there are all these kinds of questions. But despite the absence of homogeneity, African feminist knowledge could be seen to offer a standpoint that speaks back, even if in differentiated ways, to dominant views underpinned by intersecting racial, gendered, and imperial discourses. The value of taking African feminist knowledge-making into account in thinking about decolonizing would be that it counters or addresses gaps in the circulation and reception of knowledge that matters. Of particular importance here, and I believe that Harry spoke about this, is the wealth of fiction by authors like Yvonne Vera, Tsitsi Dangaremga, and of course Bessie Head that he referred to. It's in fact significant that the first formalized body of African feminist commentary was produced by critics and writers. In the 1980s, people like Nawal El-Sadawi, Ama Ata Aidu, Molara Ogundipe Leslie analyzed African women's writing in ways that valued its deviation from Western-centric subject matter, thematic expectations, and forms. This kind of emphasis has been seen to challenge seemingly universal explanations of gendered subjectivities and experiences, especially those explored by feminist literary critics in the North. But it's worth considering how this knowledge about subjectivity and psychology, and this picks up on the question that you raised, also addresses current academic work in the social science, and of course especially in psychology. Since the 1980s, the range of African feminist work in the humanities and social sciences has increased tremendously. So I'd like to isolate two areas that seem to be useful in relation to rethinking psychology. The first is related to the fiction I've mentioned. Currently, social science work that is valued and rewarded in the academy is increasingly expected to play an instrumental role in supporting public policy, social engineering, and national development. Incentives, and often actually directives, from university management, government funders, and often independent donors, is increasingly defining the terms and priorities for academics' social engagement. Often, this means that social scientists are co-opted or persuaded to follow questions that are defined elsewhere. And teaching in gender studies, I'm often struck by this trend in the work that peaks at certain times around, for example, teenage pregnancy, disability, LGBTI identities, and violence against women. Social engagement, therefore, does not mean raising questions from within autonomous critical discourses, and I think this is what Harry was starting to talk about, but responding to those problems identified by sources of support, most importantly, the state and external donors. So this situation is not unique to South Africa, and it's also obviously not unique to one discipline. It's a characteristic of a global environment that positions universities as powerhouses in an expanding knowledge economy. However, it may be the case that psychology, including what's called critical psychology, is especially vulnerable to co-optation. Because despite the critical intentions of individual academics, this work can feed into a broader process of what's been called the psychologization of society, a therapeutic paradigm in which sites of dis-ease at the personal and social level are identified and diagnosed with a view to being cured in the interests of social stability. Fiction always has the power to raise complexities and intricacies, and these are the kinds of intricacies that the blunt concepts and frameworks we use in the social sciences can't. I do think, however, that the present context of entrepreneurial research makes the power of the knowledge embedded in fiction especially important. And I wanted to say something a bit about the novel Purple Hibiscus. I don't know if people know Purple Hibiscus, probably. But for me, it's a prime example of a novel that raises critical knowledge around militarized masculinities, the links between authoritarianism and patriarchy, gender performativity, hegemonic femininities, and subaltern agencies in fiction. So I really think that if the challenge of decolonizing psychology is taken seriously, there would be a need to center forms of knowledge making, such as fiction, that have often been seen as peripheral or illustrative. And I think the emphasis to me would be to center it rather than just to kind of append it. The second theme I want to touch on, I hope I'm not running over time, is intersectionality. African feminist work since the 1980s has tried to identify and find registers and tools for exploring subject positions and relations that can't be reduced to separate parts. I referred at the start to the work of literary critics who foreground contextualized understandings of gender. Some of the most interesting feminist work, often straddling disciplines and often straddling the humanities and the social sciences, shows how African women have and continue to demonstrate forms and degrees of power in their sexual, political, and economic lives. So they show that a range of locations, often shifting and contextualized, influence women's powers in secular and religious domains, in public life, in private life, and of course, often in lives that are shown to somehow not fit into either one or the other. In other words, they break down the idea of the public being neatly divorced from the private. And I'm thinking here especially of Solveig Tamale's research on Ugandan women's political participation, as well as her work on Ugandan women's sexualities. She traces their agencies in the present to the past and shows that, and I'm quoting her here, women always wield social and political influence through indirect methods. Physical absence did not equal political passivity, which picks up on your discussion of silence, silence that speaks, silence that should be somehow heard. Intersectionality has, of course, become de rigueur in the academy, but what strikes me often is how differently this is understood. For some, like Tamale, who actually doesn't use the term, intersectionality is a lens that allows her to analyze a confluence of power relations. And because this confluence of power relations is so intricate, no neat conclusions can be distilled and kind of mobilized in the interests of X, Y, or Z. For others, intersectionality is actually little more than identifying multiple identities and the idea of layers of oppression. So just to illustrate this and to conclude, I was struck by this in an article I read recently, which is multiply authored and which claims to squarely confront intersectionality in relation to disability. And what I found disturbing was that the central argument within this incredibly thoroughly researched article was that black, working class disabled women are more oppressed than able-bodied, middle-class white women. And I know it sounds as if I'm kind of distorting this, but it seemed to me that this was the basic argument. And this is the kind of argument that I think often creeps in the place of the kind of analysis that should really be done in the name of intersectionality. So I shall stop there.